Night has a way of amplifying small sounds, and in the Pacific it could make a radio shack feel like the heart of a thunderstorm. A humid darkness pressed through the louvers, tubes glowed orange, a paper fan clicked against a nail where someone had hung it to dry. On the bench, a narrow strip of headphones connected a human skull to the sky. The operator's hand moved in small, precise arcs, sliding the dial across a wilderness of static until a pattern rose out of the noise. A rough, human rhythm surfaced short bursts, clipped acknowledgements, a voice that seemed to leap from syllable to syllable like a bird darting between branches. The men at the log table called it tori no koi, the birds talking. They wrote what they heard in katakana, the best tool they had for capturing foreign edges, and even as they wrote, they knew the marks were inadequate. The sounds didn't settle into any European contour. They didn't resemble the radio English the intercept men were used to fishing out of the air. They were precise, fast, and somehow private even while broadcast to anyone with an antenna. The puzzle was not that Americans spoke English on the radio. Everyone knew that. The puzzle was the stubborn sense that these particular voices were speaking something other than English to carry information that mattered right now, on the beach, in the trees, above the reef. The traffic behaved like combat radio time on target calls, ranging adjustments, medevac requests, route confirmations, yet the words skittered past familiar grammar. The operators tried their usual footholds. They listened for numbers. They listened for map coordinates. They listened for the cool, tired cadence of a pilot reporting fuel and altitude. What they heard instead was a language whose syllables seemed to circle meaning through metaphor, as if a crow's wing indicated a destroyer and the rising sun meant not a nation but a compass point. The vowels landed clean, the consonants clustered in, unexpected places, and the intervals between phrases were as disciplined as a parade. Whoever was speaking, they were not improvising nonsense or playing a joke on the ether. They were conducting work. In a war where radio was the bloodstream, work meant movement and fire. The men in the shack felt the proximity of consequence in their bones. A message that could not be read in time was a message that fulfilled itself on the ground. Their duty was to break the line from sound to action, to turn the birds singing into a clean report that a staff officer could use before dawn. They had done this in other theatres with other adversaries. They had mapped call signs to regiments and ships by listening to who answered whom. They had cracked open codebooks by capturing enough traffic to find a seam, then prying the seam until the text fell out in strips. Here, the strips refused to appear. The same call signs rotated, the same call and response structure held, but the words were not words they could pivot on. They were a net made out of a tongue that had not been charted for war. The first night it appeared on their net, they assumed a trick, something transitory. The second night, when the syllables returned with the same clipped assurance and the same effect on the flow of battle, anxiety entered the room. The men argued quietly about whether the syllables came from a known language. Some said Mandarin, some said a Pacific Island tongue. One man, who had worked a commercial receiver in Yokohama before the war, wondered if it might be a North American tribe he'd learned about in magazines, the kind of ethnographic curiosity filed away beside pictures of adobe houses and dances around a fire. But he admitted that his idea was not an answer. It was a story trying to fill a gap. A veteran analyst came in from the heat and watched the men for a minute before easing himself into a chair. He didn't put on headphones. He watched the operator's hands, the speed of their jots, the rhythm of the pauses. He had taught himself to read a net by the behavior of the listeners. If their bodies leaned forward in the same angle each time a voice appeared, he knew it was a node of power. If their pencils scratched and then lifted in the same interval, he could measure how long it took a message to reach its destination. He could not understand the syllables in their notebooks, but he could see the shape of value. The voice that made men lean forward had the battlefield's attention. By dawn, the shack's logbook held a dozen pages of careful shorthand and katakana approximations, the closest the listeners could come to pinning the birds to paper. They flagged a few recurring terms and drew small boxes around them, guessing at reference from the timing of the shells that followed, from the planes that appeared over the ridge, from the quiet that fell after a request for dust-off. They sketched arrows on a map and labeled them with question marks. The map contained a problem expressed in unknown frames, and their job was to draw a frame that could catch it. Outside, the island smelled of damp sand and kerosene. The day broke in a pale gold that made the sea look too innocent, as if the water did not know that men had gone into it the night before under fire. Inside, the vacuum tubes hummed, and the analyst folded his arms and began to lay out a plan. They would collect more. They would annotate more carefully. They would try a change in receiver position for cleaner capture, try a different recorder for a wider band, try pairing the recordings with the enemy's after-action reports to see if anything correlated well enough to suggest a cipher schedule. He reminded the men that every language yielded something when pressed with enough patience. The room nodded because it was the only thing to do. On the far side of the ocean, the voices that the shack called birds belonged to teenagers who had learned to herd sheep on mesas and came to boot camp with horizons bigger than maps. They wore marine uniforms but carried with them a sound the world had not trained itself to hear. In the field, they were paired, one to speak and one to copy, and the net that the shack could not name was merely their ordinary speech restrained and pointed into war. They had been told to be quick and to be exact. They had been told that the life of a platoon might depend on a single vowel's length. The voices were crisp, not because they were trying to be opaque, but because they were trying to be humane. An artillery mission called in 10 seconds faster might be the 10 seconds in which a corpsman lived to kneel beside a bleeding boy. The men in the shack could not hear any of that intent. They heard only the glide of syllables through static and the unwillingness of those syllables to arrange themselves around a table they recognized. They worked with what they had. They compared the cadence to the English cadence they knew. They searched for greetings and goodbyes, for the verbal furniture of any language that might tip them toward a family. The bird sound gave them nothing except its reliability. It was always there when the fight mattered most. It was always fast. It was always correct enough that subsequent actions followed it like footprints in wet sand. A strange, modest awe crept into their frustration. To call something birds talking is to admit that it has a beauty that escapes categorization. The operator who had first used the phrase said it half in complaint and half in admiration. He knew the war demanded he convert beauty into advantage, that he take a living rhythm and grind it until meaning fell out like flour. But another part of him sat with the headphones cocked just above his ears, listening to the rise and fall and thinking that somewhere, beyond his reach, men had found a way to use the music of their homes to keep each other alive. The plan, the analyst outlined, would move forward through daylight and back into the next night. There would be no miracles, no sudden decrypt spilling out of a lucky alignment. There would be recording reels labeled with dates and sectors. There would be careful cross-references, and there would be a growing ledger whose columns were headed with guesswork and hope. There would also be the battle, impatient and loud, running a chain of consequences between radios. In that chain, the birds talking were a pin that held many links together, and the war did not wait for anyone to cut it. This was what the birds actually were, although no one in the shack could yet say it. A human bridge built from a language that had not been drafted into global commerce, carrying the weight of fire and movement with speed that outpaced printed keys. It was not magic and not mythology. It was an ordinary miracle, practiced by men who kept their vowels steady even as the palm fronds shook under shell bursts. And because it was ordinary, it was strong. The proof would be in the way it endured across battles, across beaches, across the island names written on the wall calendar in pencil. The proof would be that the men in the shack kept listening because they had to, because they could feel that whatever those voices were saying, they were saying it in time. War in the islands made the air itself a courier. Between the tree line and the reef, between a ridge and the deck of a carrier, between a wounded squad leader and the corpsman hunched in a foxhole with a handset pressed to his cheek, the path to survival was carved in radio waves. Each dawn redrew the need for coordination. Ships had to align fire with advances. Aircraft had to strike what ground observers confirmed. Engineers had to move forward only when lanes were cleared. Medevacs needed safe corridors. Supplies had to be ferried in on the tide that would not wait for indecision. Everyone had a voice, but the air could carry only so much at once. so discipline became the currency. Nets were assigned, call signs were rotated. Silence was ordered and enforced. In that pressurized order, intercept grew as a dark mirror. Listen to the blood, and you can find the pulse. The men trained for this work had a standard kit of expectations. They would take in a raw stream of sound and treat it like a mangrove swamp with hidden paths. If you learned the trick of reading the surface ripples, you could predict where a boat would break through. Traffic analysis gave you patterns. A cell that sprang to life before every dawn landing was likely an assault net. A station that spoke rarely but made decisions in a few syllables was a flag officer. Morse gave you fingerprints. Even before you had the content, you could know the operator by the way. He leaned on a dash or hesitated at a dot, and those tiny quirks built dossiers that outlasted ships. Codebooks and ciphers gave you hope when you captured enough volume. Align the known with the unknown, and sometimes meaning cracked open along fatigue lines. In early 42, the listeners had confidence that these tools would work because they had already worked against robust opponents. Even when faced with allied systems that prided themselves on modernity, the listeners could gnaw and pry until something useful came away in their teeth. They were aided by the physical nature of the theatre. Islands simplified direction finding. Once you had a bearing and a few fixes, you could triangulate with a clarity the European planes sometimes denied. Weather patterns and daily cycles also gave an analyst's comfort. You could predict when a net would be most active by the necessities of heat and light, and predicting activity meant placing your ears where they would do the most. Then the war thickened. The opposing logistics matured and grew clever. The Americans proliferated nets in a way that didn't map neatly to pre-war expectations, and at crucial moments they prioritized voice over Morse for speed and flexibility. In principle, voice was easier for a human ear to pass than streams of dots and dashes. In practice, voice arrived, laced with accents, jargon, and what analysts called combat compression words, shaved of syllables, and rammed into gaps between gunfire. If that voice used an unfamiliar language rather than accented English, the compression worked like armor. Even the best antenna could not amplify a phoneme that a listener did not know how to hear. Pressure built to read the air because the cost of failing to read was visible on maps and in casualty lists. If you could not understand the method behind the birds talking, you could not anticipate the corrections being called into batteries, and a beach you thought safe might become a web of brackets and crossfires. If you could not map who the voices belonged to and how they moved across sectors, you could not draw reliable estimates of opposing force structure, and your staff work would drift into myth. Intelligence must turn sound into lines and arrows, or it is a decorative echo. Across the theatre, the men doing the listening felt a common sprint without a finish line. The race was fought with hours and with narrow improvements. A receiver moved 10 meters, could remove a local source of interference, and pull a voice an inch closer. A better log format could reduce the time it took to find a pattern across days. A liaison with an air reconnaissance unit might give you a correlating photograph that suggested a referent for a recurring syllable. Each gain was small, but small gains were how this part of the war was fought. No one expected lightning. They expected accumulation. They also expected the enemy to be consistent in his needs. Artillery needed information. Air needed information. Medical needed information. Logistics needed information. A voice system that could answer those needs faster and with fewer errors would be rewarded by commanders who saw that speed in the outcomes they cared about. The birds talking were rewarded in this way, and the reward radiated outward as a problem. What is used more will be heard more. What is heard more will change the battle more. What changes the battle more must be understood. The race bent itself around that curve, and the listeners ran harder. On landings where the ocean came in green and the sand flashed white under shell bursts, observers with binoculars and handsets became pivot points between air, sea, and ground. They stood on amphibious tractors, on coral heads, on the rear decks of tanks. Behind them and above them, pilots orbited with bomb bays open and guns ready. waiting for a voice to turn raw potential into a dive or a run. That voice had to land with unambiguous coordinates or a metaphor precise enough to call out a landmark no map had bothered to name. The men on the listening side could plot the timing, a phrase, a paused breath, a confirmation, then the smear of aircraft coming down the slot. As much as interception is about content, it is also about tempo, and the tempo here became an education. They learned that these nets settled their business in seconds. They learned that repetition was minimal. They learned that discipline was not the luxury of calm, but the method of survival. In a staff hut far from the lagoon, an officer sharpened a pencil and sketched a triangle. Ground observer, air cover, artillery. He connected the points and wrote voice along each line, and beneath it he wrote faster. He did not know what the birds were saying, but he could see what they were doing. They were keeping the lines tight so that the triangle moved like a single hand. If you could jam that voice, you might slow the hand. If you could replace it with confusion, you might force the triangle to split into independent motions vulnerable to delay. But jamming was blunt, and the birds seemed to shift nets and reappear with the same crispness before jammers found the right frequency. Replacement was impossible without understanding, and understanding was the thing that ran away each time the headphones were set on a head. So men turned to older habits. They listened for personality, for the small human variations that made one operator distinct from another. If you could not translate the content, you might still build a map of who stood where and which voices tended to be present when certain units moved. These maps could be valuable in their own way. If a familiar voice moved to a new sector, it might herald a shift in focus. Yet this work ran into another kind of discipline. The birds' nets followed procedures that flattened individuality on purpose. They were not anonymous so much as professional, and professionalism is a hard enemy to read by ear. The race to read the air is usually described in terms of machines, the receivers, the antennas, the recorders, but the real race was between human limits. On one side, listeners stretched their attention across hours, trying to thread scattered fragments into narratives that would hold in daylight. On the other, speakers stretched their training to keep messages short, unambiguous, and perfectly fitted to action. Where those two efforts met was the moment when an island's fate tilted one way or another. The birds talking were not, in truth, birds. They were men, young and old, who had been taught to take a language shaped by family and ceremony and aim it into a handset, and by doing so to bend time toward their side. To intercept is to enter a race with time and lose often. To speak well is to take the same race and win by seconds. The island did not care who won, but the men in the sand did, and so the air became a track, and everyone ran as if breath were a weapon. To understand the voices that the intercept shacks labeled as birds, you have to leave the ocean and climb toward a sky so large the horizon feels like a prayer. On mesas brushed with sage and broken by sandstone spires, boys learned to listen before they learned to speak. They listened to wind stepping through juniper. They listened to sheep bells and hoof thrum and the crack of distant thunder that announced a storm long before it arrived. When they spoke, their sentences curled around respect and kinship, and the language that carried those sentences layered meaning on meaning like clay built into a pot. That language was Navajo, Dine Bizard, and for most of the world it was a sound beyond everyday commerce, a river that ran beautifully but far from ports. When recruiters came with khaki uniforms and promises of meals that arrived on time, they also carried a quiet request: bring that river to war. The men who answered were not chosen because they were exotic. They were chosen because they were fluent and steady and young enough to learn how to be Marines in weeks. Boot camp stripped and built, as it always does, but something essential traveled intact inside the recruits' chests. They laughed in a cadence not written in any field manual, and at night they sang softly to themselves in a language that carried more than words. It carried relatives and sheep paths, and the outlines of constellations you could use to return home in the dark. At a stateside base, a small cadre laid out a new kind of curriculum. The goal was not to turn the language into a cipher by itself. The goal was to teach how to harness it so efficiently that it could carry military meaning faster and with fewer errors than conventional codes. The men sat at tables and wrote lists. They took words that belonged to land and sky and mapped them onto machines that rolled and flew. A buzzard became a bomber, a hummingbird became a fighter, a turtle became a tank. These were not whimsical choices. They were memory anchors and metaphoric bridges, constructing a vocabulary that let a young man picture what he said as he said it. The mapping extended beyond nouns. There was also a phonetic alphabet built from everyday terms, so names and grid coordinates could be spelled with a rhythm that made copying reliable even when the air cracked with interference. The instructors tested again and again under stress. The voices had to come through clean. The men laughed sometimes at the strangeness of telling a hummingbird to climb to angels. Or calling for the turtle to move left one house and stop. They were young, and young men in uniform always joke to make fear fit into their pockets. But they also understood the gravity of what they were building, because every drill ended with a stopwatch and someone pointing to a number that represented the time between a spotter's eyes and a shell landing where it was meant to land. They practiced until their mouths moved faster than their minds, because in battle thinking is a luxury no one can afford at length. It was not a matter of secret magic. It was a matter of stacking advantages, familiar sound, short syllables, memorized associations until the stack reached over the wall that time built in front of everyone. When they shipped out, the young men in those green uniforms carried notebooks that would not survive the first rain. The true lists lived in their minds, and the lists were not rigid. They could shift synonyms if a referent risked confusion. They could repoint a metaphor if a new piece of kit appeared that needed a name. Flexibility was part of the design. In a world where code books became liabilities, the moment an enemy grabbed one, a living language trained into disciplined purpose became its own safeguard. You could not drop a language in a ditch for an enemy to find. You could not seize it off a table and flip through it under a hurricane lamp, searching for a known phrase to pry into. The language moved only on a breath between two men, and when one breath ended, another began it again. Discipline wrapped this living system. The Marines who carried it did not operate alone, no matter what movies would later imply. They were paired so that one spoke and one copied, built-in redundancy in case a shell or a splinter took a hand away. They stayed tied to their unit's nets, not as adornments but as cords that kept information flowing in a particular shape the commanders could count on. If they were needed on a flank, they moved fast and set up with the same economy of motion as a machine gun team. If they were summoned to a command post, they arrived with the calm of men who have memorized their role so deeply that nerves cannot tug it loose. Every net has a tone that its users recognize, and the tone of a net anchored by these voices was clean, unhurried even in terror, steady as if the speakers had found a place inside themselves where the wind could not reach. The voices were not ignorant of how the other side heard them. Rumors drifted through units about the enemy's bewilderment, about nicknames bestowed in distant shacks. The young men shrugged at the idea of being mistaken for birds. Birds, after all, are good messengers. What mattered to them was the moment when a spoken line made an aircraft wing dip and turn, when a battery hushed for a breath and then spoke in thunder that walked across a ridgeline exactly where it was meant to walk. They lived on the boundary between language as family and language as instrument, and they protected both. They did not explain themselves over the air, because radios are not classrooms. They explained themselves in results. Many had left behind elders who had been told, not long before, that their children's language belonged in the past. They knew the weight of an anthropology text that listed verbs like curios, pinned like beetles. In the Pacific, the weight slid off. Something old had been asked to do something painfully modern, and it did it with a flair that impressed even men who did not know they were being impressed. The speakers felt that mixture too. The pride wound tight with sadness. They could be proud that their words kept men alive. They could be sad that the path to recognition ran through mud and noise rather than a clean ceremonial ground. Pride won most days, because saving a friend is louder than regret. You could hear the difference in how other Marines spoke to them. At first, there was the inevitable ribbing that young men spill on anyone not exactly like themselves. Then there was the shift, the quiet lift in tone that arrives when a person becomes indispensable. A platoon leader would tap a shoulder and say, "Stand here, say it now," and the men around would make room without comment. The Marines, with the headsets and the notebooks, began as curiosities and settled into the role every unit longs to have. The ones who, when things go wrong, make them less wrong with a sentence that takes 3 seconds to say and 10 seconds to unfold as action. Across that action lay the thing a battlefield worships: trust. Trust has a sound. It is the brief silence after a message, the confidence that the reply will be the right reply and not a fog. It is the way a radio operator's shoulders lower when a familiar voice arrives. It is the way a pilot reading the beach from 1,000 feet knows that the words coming through the headphones will match what his eyes will see when he banks into the run. The Navajo Marines earned that sound hour by hour. They did not advertise it. They did not explain how a syllable might contain a map. They did the work and let the air carry the proof. Imagine you have to tell a friend, under fire, to put 3 shells on a machine gun nest 2 houses north of the church. You can write it on paper, run it to a radio, encrypt it with a book, read it back, hope the operator on the other end decrypts it correctly, and then hope the battery chief interprets the map reference without error. Or you can say it in a language the enemy does not understand, using a shared vocabulary and a cadence both of you have rehearsed until you could recite it in your sleep, and then you can listen for the shells and correct on the fly. The first method is sturdy but slow. The second is agile by design. The system that the birds talking pointed to was the second method, done with rigorous attention to speed, clarity, and survivability. 2 layers made it work. The first was the language itself, a soundscape that, in the 1,940 seconds, very few people outside its communities could pass at all, much less in battlefield fragments. That layer alone did not make the system secure in a mathematical sense, but it erected a wall tall enough that the enemy's ordinary ladders, frequency tables, crib hunts, dictionary pivots could not reach the top before a battle's needs ended. The second layer was the constructed vocabulary, which turned the language from a general-purpose tool into a tactical instrument. This vocabulary was not just a list of nouns paired with military objects. It was a coherent grammar of reference built for speed, which matters in 3 decisive ways. It shortens the number of syllables required to say something exact. It reduces ambiguity by choosing metaphors the speakers share to the bone. And it permits immediate correction without stumbling because the mapping feels natural to the tongue that holds it. Consider aircraft. In the system, you might use a word that calls to mind a bird with traits that mirror the aircraft's role. A heavy bomber becomes a bird known for wide wings and patient circling. A fighter becomes a bird known for speed and darting aggression. These choices are not poetics piled on war. They are mnemonics that make error less likely at the speed war demands. When a speaker says the word, he is not mentally translating from English to a code word. He is drawing directly from a memory chain forged in youth and annealed in training. That directness is why a message can leave his mouth at conversational speed and still land as precise instruction. The mapping extended into letters and numbers, because names and coordinates are the bones of battle. The commode, phonetic alphabet, turned everyday terms into a string that could survive static. Each letter had a stand-in that avoided collision with others under poor conditions. The result felt like the English language phonetic system pilots used, but tuned to the mouths and ears of the men carrying the net. They could spell a map reference with a musicality that made mistakes obvious. If a recorder later played back the tape and found a gap at a point where interference had jumped, the context built by the mapping and the cadence often let the copyist fill in what had been lost without guesswork. Brevity codes rounded out the method. There is a kind of sentence that wars teach you to love, the one in which a noun and a verb and a few digits do enough work to move metal across distance into a place where it will make the day survivable. The system embraced this kind of sentence. It did not try to be everything. It did not attempt to carry literature or philosophy. It carried target descriptions, corrections, logistics hooks, casualty reports, and status checks. It did so with a cool voice, because a cool voice wastes less oxygen. Emergency signals had their own flavor, a snap that listeners learned to lean toward, but even then the scaffolding of structure held. Calm, in this context, is not a personality trait. It is an engineering choice. Error checking entered at 2 points. First, pairs. No one spoke without someone copying beside him. If the air swallowed a syllable, the partner flagged it, and the net absorbed the cost of a quick repeat rather than the catastrophic cost of wrong fire. Second, procedural phrasing. Certain instructions were framed in ways that made miscopying statistically unlikely. The language's own morphology helped here. If you are used to long words built from interlocking parts, you develop a habit of hearing the parts, and that habit becomes a filter against noise. The adversary could record hours of this exchange and still sit beyond the window where such subtlety operates. Without the training that shapes ear and mouth together, a recording remains a map to a country you cannot enter. Flexibility made the system resilient. A rigid codebook is a single point of failure. A living mapping that can introduce a synonym if confusion creeps in is a net with redundant strands. The speakers had guidance on preferred terms, but they were not trapped by them. If a new weapon appeared, a new metaphor could be minted that afternoon, and after an hour's practice it would move with the same ease as an old one. Discipline turned this flexibility into order. Units held periodic refreshers. Pairs reviewed their notebooks. Leaders enforced radio schedules and net hygiene so that the air would not clot with needless chatter. The enemy's usual attacks on voice jamming, spoofing found poor purchase against a system that changed frequency as a matter of course, and whose internal logic could be sensed by those trained and remained obscure to those who were not. It is tempting, especially after the fact, to call such a system unbreakable. Nothing human is unbreakable. But battle is not a graduate seminar in cryptanalysis. It is a furnace in which the timelines of success and failure are counted in seconds and minutes, not months. The security that mattered was not the kind measured by proofs. It was the kind measured by whether an enemy could turn an intercept into a useful forecast before the shells landed and the squad moved. On that measure, the two-layer design language barrier plus constructed vocabulary achieved what it set out to achieve. It denied the adversary the present tense. It kept the moment of action private long enough for the action to become irreversible. Watch a sequence play out. An observer sees muzzle flashes from a ridge. He keys his handset and describes the landmark and the distance in a string that compresses into less than a breath. A voice answers, copies, repeats the core instruction, exactly once. Within a minute, a battery adjusts, the guns thud, and the ridge erupts. The observer corrects with another short line. The correction lands. Between those two lines lies a speed advantage that cannot be taxed away by cleverness. If you place the enemy's best listener 10 meters away with perfect equipment, he would still be pulling on a thread whose other end had already tied its knot. The beauty of the design is not metaphorical. It is practical and measurable in lives. By stripping away the fiddle of keys and pads for the messages that most urgently demanded breath and replacing them with a disciplined language channel, the system gave small units a tool that moved at the speed of thought, while retaining enough structure to keep that speed safe. It could coexist with more traditional cryptography, and it did. Not every message belongs on quick voice. Some need the privacy of books. But for the slice of war where seconds carry the world, the speakers turned something older than any field manual into a modern instrument. The enemy called it birds talking because it moved with a natural grace they could hear but not hold. The speakers did not need to call it anything at all. They called in fire, they called for air, they called for help, and the help came. The room had rules born from long nights. No one raised a voice when the recording snagged. No one cursed when a reel ended as an answer began. Men who lived by nerves learned to treat nerves like a misbehaving dog. Acknowledge it, then make it heal. On the table lay pencil stubs, grease pencils worn to waxy nubs, protractors, maps, and a handful of letters from home that had nothing to do with the moment, except to remind everyone that time was made of more than shifts. The headphones clicked, tubes hummed, and a young operator rolled a dial 1 millimeter at a time until the net they feared and admired came riding in, syllables bright against static like sparks crossing a dark shop floor. They called it the birds, talking not because they were dismissive, but because they needed a phrase the room could carry without flinching. The phrase kept the problem at a human size. Frequency analysis is faith in repetition. If a system uses fixed substitutions, a symbol that means E will appear more often than one that means Q, and syllables that carry common words will recur in clusters you can plot into confidence. The listeners tried to build that faith. They counted and graphed by hand. They told themselves that any human pattern would yield if love of counting were intense enough. But the syllables refused to settle into the bins a schoolroom taught you to expect. A metaphor standing in for a machine is not the same as a plain noun. Rotate a synonym and the counts slide. Let two trained men vary phrasing inside a shared logic, and your table loses its foothold. The very thing that made the system fast, human fluency, made the numbers slippery. Cribs are the cryptanalysts' comfort food, predictable phrases you expect, and therefore a pry bar you can fit into a seam. Weather reports, salutations, standard headers, the phrases everyone relies on because they feel civilized. The listeners hunted cribs and found only professionalism. The nets did not begin with chatter or pleasantries, they began with work. When someone asked for fire on the orchard wall, he said it once and did not sandwich it with anything that could be mistaken for a greeting. This economy denied the enemy the easy hooks they loved. No formal openings to line up along margins, no repeated signatures to circle in red. Route mapping offered another line of hope. When you can track who calls whom and in what sequences, you can sketch authority and role. Even if content remains opaque, structure becomes a lantern. Here, too, the lantern flickered. The nets followed procedure that flattened theatrics and avoided the flourishes that make a personality obvious. Call signs rotated on a schedule. Frequencies migrated with a discipline that suggested a net manager who believed in hygiene the way a chaplain believes in prayer. The result was a diagram with many arrows and few names you could write with confidence. It was not empty. It was sterile in the precise way a careful system aspires to be. The human ear is a tool, and it was pushed hard. The men tried to hear phoneme boundaries, to mark where one word ended and another began. But they were struggling with sound families that did not match their training. A vowel stretched in a particular way might carry meaning in one language and serve as mere breathing in another. Consonants clustered in ways that skidded past a listener who had never learned their friction in childhood. You can instruct a man to listen for a shape he has never seen, but you cannot give him eyes for it in a week. The result on paper looked like honest effort, knocked about by an unfamiliar wind. When a system resists your usual tools, you build a new one. A hybrid method that combines the small exploit with the small correlation and asks them to add up to a foothold. The shacks tried. They paired minutes of traffic with map events. They circled a recurring term and circled a feature that had mattered in the same window. Patterns emerged and slid away, like fish you grasped with wet hands. The problem was not that the system was unknowable. The problem was that it was knowable only at a timescale, useless to men trying to keep up with mortars. Imitation sometimes saves an analyst. You stage your own net, try to copy cadence and protocol, and see if pretending teaches you the truth of what you are watching. Crews attempted this with imperfect success. They could create a rhythm, but they could not create comprehension, and without comprehension the rhythm produced nothing but a more sophisticated frustration. It was like miming a song in a language whose emotion you felt, but whose words you could not summon. On paper, the imitation looked convincing. In the throat it felt hollow. The hollowness was the difference between theatre and craft. In the end, the struggle sat between two clocks. One measured the speed of speaking, tuned to the beating heart of firefights. The other measured the speed of understanding from the outside, lagging by hours and then days. Each improvement tightened the lag only a little, and in war a little is often not enough. Pride did not keep the listeners from admitting this. They were professionals, and professionals hate waste. They did not romanticize the voices as exotic or mystical. They recognized a clean, thoughtful design, executed with discipline, and they respected it even as they fought it. There are defeats that break morale. This was not one of them. The men were not bested by sloppiness or superstition. They were bested by discipline and speed. Respect entered the room and made itself at home. It did not soften the work, it sharpened it. Respect kept them honest about what they could and could not do. They returned to their chairs and their reels. The birds talked, the pencils moved. The reports, when they could not draw conclusions, recorded limits with clarity. In a profession that values certainty, clear limits are a form of courage. That courage held until the tape clicked and another voice arrived, bright as flint. In the jungle, sound moves like water through roots, curling around trunks, pooling under leaves, and slipping downslope in a trickle you feel more than hear. Radios cut through that watery hush in thin, bright lines. On Guadalcanal, those bright lines often connected a set of eyes with a set of guns. The men who carried the language across that gap learned quickly what worked and what broke. The island was a teacher with a mean temperament. If a word cost too much breath, it punished you with delay. If a phrase confused a gun line, it punished you with silence when you needed thunder. The net adapted the way living things adapt, by pruning what wasted energy and strengthening what moved life forward. Picture an observation post tucked behind a curtain of ferns on a low ridge. A pair of Marines sit shoulder to shoulder, one with the handset, one with the book and pencil. The handset man has his binoculars braced against a root. Through the glass he sees muzzle flashes licking from a grove near a short line of huts. He does not say huts on the air, because huts are the landscape of 1,000 villages, and every villager places them differently in his mind. He says the coded image both men share and anchors it with distance. The reply snaps back, measured and calm. When the first rounds walk wide, he corrects without commentary or apology. Words are a tool, and tools do not explain themselves in use. The next volley lands inside the grove's edge where the flashes thin and then stop. Guadalcanal demonstrated that the system did not simply keep secrets, it delivered tempo. The proof lay in the way units began to treat the handsets as the equal of an extra machine gun. You could feel the change in posture when the speakers arrived at a company command post. Faces eased, not because anyone believed words could stop bullets, but because experience had shown that words could bend bullets in the right direction faster than anything else on hand. When weather socked in and aircraft flew by instruments, the net still carried adjustments that made sense to men staring through rain at a hill that had no name on any useful map. The language put a finger on that hill and pushed. Bougainville taught the same lesson with different scenery. The ridges there are sly, rising in humps that make maps into liars, and the canopy creates a false sky. Voice had to do double duty, carry meaning to the battery and repair the map inside the minds of everyone listening. The mapping worked because the terms were not ornaments but tools. When the handset man called a feature by a metaphor the team shared, the metaphor did more than paint. It pointed. The battery could picture terrain without seeing it, which is a kind of magic produced not by mysticism but by training. The listening shacks caught a flavor of this even without translation. Analysts, skeptical by habit, have ears for confidence. Confidence comes across as measured speech. Panic lengthens vowels and tightens breath. The confidence that breeds trust shortens breath without strangling articulation. The recordings from those battles have that tone. An operator might later mark where a shell impacted by the tremble in the handset, but he would also mark the absence of tremble in the voice. The calm was not a personality trait. It was the design doing what it was meant to do, give fear less room to grow. Doctrine grew in quiet ways. Platoons that initially treated the radio pair as curiosities began to plan around them as they would around crew-served weapons. Leaders learned to keep lines of sight open not only for rifles, but for the imaginations of the speakers. A clear image in a speaker's mind resulted in a clear instruction on the net. Patrols rehearsed, naming the world in the shared vocabulary during daylight, so that at dusk there would be no hesitation. When a term risked confusion, pairs pruned it. When a new landmark mattered, pairs minted a term that felt inevitable the moment it left the mouth. The inevitability was the clue that the metaphor had been chosen well. Countermeasures behaved as expected, and then failed in the same ways. Jamming arrived when schedules were predictable, so schedules became less predictable. Spoofing demanded mimicry, and mimicry collapsed in the first two sentences because the cadence had seams too subtle to fake. Even if a voice could copy the surface features, it could not inhabit the posture that made those features consistent under stress. The best attempts sounded like parody to anyone trained in the net's inner logic. By the time the campaign shifted, men could list the so's, ordinary miracles the voice made. A pinned patrol walked out because mortars came down where they were needed with only 2 corrections. A field hospital survived a night because a pilot, guided by a sentence, dropped flares where a doctor had asked for a hallway of light. A barge run made it past a headland because a lookout and a handset and a phrase about a particular rock stitched a safe passage from dark. These are small stories measured against the size of a war, but wars are built from small stories multiplied. The shacks wrote it all down. They logged the minutes when the net came alive, the minutes when the island went quiet again, the likely connections between a voice and a burst of fire. They had to produce reports with arrows and question marks that captured reality without capturing essence. They were honest reports, even when they confessed ignorance, and honesty is an achievement when a war's machinery demands certainty. The island made men exaggerate, the net made men precise. Precision won more often than bravado, and that arithmetic turned into habit the way rain turns dirt into path. Iwo Jima is a piece of ground designed to punish the soft parts of men. The sand is not sand but ground pumice that gives way under boots like cold ash. The air smells like eggs when the vents breathe. The first thing a body learns is how hard it is to cross 100 yards when the earth wants to swallow your ankles. The second thing it learns is that distance is not measured only in yards. Distance can be measured in the number of words it takes to make guns and men agree. On that island, the number had to be small. The radios arrived heavy with dust and expectation. Men who had spoken on other islands looked at the ridges and blockhouses and knew that a system's worth would be tallied not only by whether it kept a secret from the enemy's ear, but by how many true, actionable sentences it could push through each hour without collapsing. Cryptography is often described with the language of locks and keys. Throughput insists on another metaphor: plumbing. Pipes must be wide enough and leak little. By design, the system widened the pipe by keeping encoding in the mouth and decoding in the ear, with the vocabulary acting as valve and gasket to prevent loss. On D+ days that felt like a single day stretched on a rack, pairs settled into pits and alcoves behind broken ground. A call for fire moved across the net with a compression rehearsed for months, and the answer returned with the same economy. What distinguished Iwo was not only speed per message, but the aggregate effect of hundreds of such messages. Air, ground, and sea were packed around the rock. The net stitched density into coordination rather than chaos. A pilot rolling in could trust that the sentence he heard had been checked twice by discipline, not padded by fear. Men who lived through the assault remember how often corrections were minimal. A single digit shifted, a single word replaced another. When you are moving through ash, conserving breath becomes a form of grace, and the net honored that economy. The listeners on the other side recorded an astonishing volume of traffic that never slipped into the slackness that volume usually induces. Throughput, in a naive design, invites slop. On Iwo, the opposite occurred. The more that was said, the more strictly it was said, because the stakes trimmed excess like a blade. Imagine the strain on a traditional codebook system in that crush. Each message would queue for encipherment, for checking, for readback, and for decipherment at the far end. Humans could do it, as humans can do nearly anything with enough will, but the queue itself would have killed men. By keeping the encoding in the mouth and the decoding in the ear, the system avoided the queues and allowed competence to scale. Scale is the word radio rooms avoid because scaling chaos multiplies only pain. On Iwo, scale meant more pairs, more disciplined phrases, more tightly managed nets, capacity added without adding confusion. There were moments when the island tested even this. Mines popped in chains, volcanic vents altered wind in ways pilots swore changed their runs. A machine gun that should have died under the last barrage sprouted a second head. In those moments, the net did not grow florid. It grew tighter. A voice would say the necessary in a line as strict as a commandment. The strictness was not harshness. It was love shaped into utility. To keep another man alive, you choose small words, and you order them well. At the staff level, officers could chart throughput like a weather map. They could point to hours when the net carried the heaviest pressure and match those to advances across the island's grudging surface. They could also match them to hours when ships adjusted, planes orbited, and evacuation routes stayed open long enough for full litters to reach barges. You could see, on paper, that the voice did more than keep secrets from an enemy. It made structure visible to friends who needed to act without hesitation. From the opponent's perspective, the cruelty of the design revealed itself. They could collect reams of recordings and improve antenna placement and devote fresh minds to the puzzle. None of that changed the through line. By the time analysis could suggest a pattern with confidence, the pattern had already burned itself into glass on the island and was gone. The geometry of the battle moved in strokes too quick for contemplation. The only way to steal usefulness would have been to be inside the system, and that door did not open to microphones. There were, of course, failures. A word swallowed by static at the wrong instant, a synonym that echoed another term and made a battery check twice, a frequency shift that left a partner net a beat behind. The island punished hesitation with a miser's glee. What matters is that the failures remained singular while the successes stacked. When men describe the net afterward, they do not tell fabulous tales. They describe an ongoing, modest miracle. Hundreds of small messages that landed clean enough to bend events by inches, and on that island an inch could be a life. At dusk, the ash turns a sullen purple, and the vents breathe like sleeping animals. Radios glow like embers, and voices thicken with fatigue. The net in those hours risks slurring, the way any community risks slurring after too much pain. On Iwo, the opposite often occurred. The discipline that throughput requires hardened into ritual. A man would say his line and no more. The answer would come, and no more. Silence would fall, not hungry, not fearful, but useful, like a hand laid on a shoulder that says keep moving. That cadence, made of heat and grit, made the difference between stumbling and advance. Cryptanalysis likes footholds. It likes the way a repeated phrase carves a step into a cliff, and the way predictable courtesy lays down a handhold where none belongs in a fight. The system that carried the voices refused footholds with a gentleness that feels, in retrospect, like a trap set by a craftsman rather than a brute. Its gentleness came from the nature of the language itself, which grew for hundreds of years to suit its people and land, and only later accepted the burden of war. Start with phonology, the way the mouth shapes sound. If your ear is tuned from childhood to one set of contrasts, another set can feel like smoke. Vowels lengthen and shorten with consequences your school never taught you to care about. Consonants ride in clusters your tongue was not asked to practice, and when you try to pin them on paper, they squirm away because your alphabet was built to capture other beasts. The listeners worked at this. They were not lazy. They trained themselves to mark where breathing ended and speech began, to separate echoes from intention. Still, their notes showed the stubbornness of a soundscape that did not wish to be mapped with their tools. Move to morphology, the way words are built from parts. In a language where meaningful pieces latch onto each other in long, precise chains, the relation between sound and sense becomes a dance. An outsider can watch but not lead. A single term can carry what another language needs a phrase to express, and when the term belongs to a trained vocabulary, its edges sharpen under stress. The enemy might record such a term 100 times and never be sure what to carve away without dulling the meaning. A miscut here does not produce a near miss. It produces nonsense. Then semantics, the core of meaning itself. The constructed vocabulary mapped machines and directions and actions onto images the speakers could call up without effort. To an outsider, an image feels like a riddle. To an insider, an image is a pointer that removes ambiguity. This inversion is the heart of the trapdoor. A riddle consumes time as you try to solve it. A pointer gives time back because it requires no solving at all. The trapdoor opened under the analysts not because they were clumsy, but because the flaw they expected was never meant for them. Even the act of copying refused easy capture. When two men share a cadence, one can interrupt and resume the other's thought with an elegance that makes transcripts lie. A recording might show a broken line where interference struck. The copyist's pencil might gloss the break because he knew, from grammar and procedure, which possibilities could fit and which could not. From outside, that looks like risky guesswork. From inside, it is trained narrowing, the same kind of narrowing that lets a medic reach for the right vial without reading the label in a dark tent. It is worth emphasizing that none of this made the system a talisman against thought. If the battle had paused for a month, and recordings had filled a ship, and the shacks had leisure to build grammars and test hypotheses like professors, the trapdoor would have yielded. Human beings can learn each other. They do it in peace with patience and love. But patience did not exist on the beaches and ridges. The calendar permitted only the kind of learning measured in seconds. In that frame, the trapdoor held because it did not need to last forever. It needed to last until dusk. There is a temptation to say the trapdoor stood because the language had been hidden by geography and history. Hiddenness helped, but it is not the essence. The essence lies in the fact that the language was alive, changing in small ways as every living language changes, guided in this context by men who had incentives to keep it both beautiful and useful. A codebook ossifies. A living tongue prunes and grows. If a term risked confusion, it could be swapped for another that tasted cleaner in the mouth under stress. The swap happened in an afternoon's practice, and walked onto the net that evening as if it had always existed. One more hinge sat under the trapdoor. Culture. Culture teaches what matters in an instant. It tells a speaker which details to foreground and which to omit because everyone already knows them. On the net, culture kept messages spare. You do not explain to a cousin how the hill looks when both of you grew up watching hills the same way. You name the angle and the distance and trust that the mirror in his mind will fill the rest. Culture shaped pacing too. Pauses carried meaning, not only as rests for breath but as punctuation that the trained ear could read as surely as ink. All of this sounds esoteric until you place it back in the dirt. The trapdoor worked because, at the sharp end, it saved lives. A system that saves lives gets used more. Getting used more makes it more opaque to enemies who lack immersion because the margin for slow explanation vanishes. You could hear this in the way a squad would wait on a word and then move with the commitment of men stepping onto a bridge they cannot see but trust. The bridge existed. It was made of sound and memory. The men who walked it did not care what metaphor an analyst might choose. They cared that it held. Stand at the edge of the metaphor and look down. You see boards and think floor. Someone else, smiling slightly, knows there is a hollow below and a latch that opens to a particular touch. The touch is fluency, and fluency is not built from dictionaries alone. It is built from mothers' voices, jokes between cousins, songs learned at night when the electricity fails, and 100 other small chords that tie meaning to memory. The system braided those chords and threw the braid over a gap. From the gap it looked like magic. From the braid it felt like home turned into help. Myths are the flotsam of war. They wash up after the tide and look, at first glance, like treasure. This story collected more than its share. The easiest myth says the voices were a conjurer's trick, an unbreakable secret because there were no books, no recordings, nothing for an outsider to hold. The men who carried the headsets would have smiled at that. There were books in libraries and notes in archives. There were scholars who had written down hymns and stories. But books are not breath. What lived on the air was a cadence shaped by use, a mapping forged for speed, and a grammar flexed to fit the work of a morning. Even with a shelf of references, you could not keep up with a correction spoken at the edge of an airstrike. The truth is more ordinary and more impressive. The security that mattered was time. The voices bought seconds where everyone else spent minutes, and seconds are the currency of survival. Another myth insists that the system replaced every other method, that once the voices arrived, every codebook went into the stove. No one who ran a staff tent believes this. There were messages that belonged in the slow vaults, orders that needed to be insulated from chance. The net was a scalpel, not a pantry. It cut quickly, cleanly, where the body of the day demanded surgery. The larger organs of a campaign, the long-term plans, the deceptive feints still travelled in the padded envelopes of ciphers and one-time pads. To imagine a single tool doing everything is to misunderstand tools. The work was shared. The fast voice shaped the moment. The slow key guarded the horizon. A persistent rumour claims that the system held because the enemy never took it seriously, that it was dismissed as quaint and so escaped the weight of a real assault. The record contradicts this in the way serious work always contradicts gossip. The intercept shacks filled reels and notebooks. Antennas were moved. Operators trained their ears until fatigue wore grooves in their days. Reports were written that did not pretend understanding but documented regularities with respect. Failure in this realm did not come from neglect. It came from a mismatch between method and clock. The voices did not need to be invincible. They needed only to be faster than the instruments arrayed against them. There is also the romance that paints the speakers as singular heroes, lone saviors whose sentences held whole beaches intact. Every man wearing the globe and anchor could name a dozen kinds of heroism that kept him alive. A private who kept his head and cut a lane through wire. A coxswain who nosed a boat onto a reef and made it look easy. A supply clerk who refused to lose track of morphine. The speakers stood among them, not at the front of a parade. Their gift was to make other gifts more effective. When a line of flame threw light on a cave mouth, a sentence turned that light into a map. When a map strained under fog, a sentence smoothed its wrinkles. They did not need to be miracles because the war already contained enough. They needed to be consistent. The most flattering myth belongs to nostalgia. It says that such a system could only exist then, in that war, among those men, and that the modern world's noise and surveillance would strangle anything so simple. The counterpoint is found in any emergency when power fails and machines grow dumb. Human beings fall back on voice and on the trust built by practice. A net that prizes brevity, clarity, and shared images works in any century. The tools change. The physics of attention do not. If you doubt it, listen to recordings from fires or storms where dispatchers and crews trade life in fragments. What saves people is not a fashion of technology but the discipline beneath it. The distance between myth and reality is often the width of a breath. A fast story inflates, a real one sits in the lungs and warms. The warm truth is that a living language, placed with care into military hands, made small units more precise than their fear and faster than their enemies. It drew strength from training, from a shared sense of image, from procedures enforced by sergeants who knew what confusion costs. It is less cinematic than the myths and more durable. The best parts of the story are not the ones you can embroider. They are the parts that stood up in mud and salt air and did their jobs until the day was done. Every advantage invites a response, and the men who managed nets knew better than to mistake success for permanence. They treated the air as a contested space even when it sounded empty. The first answer to attention was movement. Frequency plans that stepped smoothly across bands, schedules that looked regular enough to be civilized but slid enough to deny easy prediction. An operator could look at his watch and feel the rhythm of a day, yet the rhythm never calcified into something an outsider could set his own watch by. If jamming thickened one channel, a switch made the next channel feel like a sigh of relief. Procedure guarded the rest. Call signs changed as predictably as sunrise and as ungraspably as a hand moving across a face in shadow. Authentication lived not in elaborate rituals, but in a pattern of exchange that made imposters stumble. Spoofers tried and found themselves betrayed by pacing, by the way a trained voice pairs necessity and courtesy in a ratio that feels right only to those who live inside it. The net did not rely on any one trick. It relied on the familiarity that grows inside teams that practice together. A corporal could hear the difference between a man who had been through the drills and a man reading from a sheet. Another layer was physical. Pairs dispersed, antennas crouched, cables were buried under thin skins of sand. Nets were arranged to deny an eavesdropper long, clean lines of capture. Short transmissions, small power, good antennas, better placement. These are not glamorous measures, but glamour has never saved a message. The goal was simple: shorten the window in which the enemy's best gear could listen and move before the listening congealed into advantage. A message that lasts 2 seconds and is spoken once makes a recording technician swear softly in 3 languages. Discipline reached into the content itself. Brevity was not a slogan, it was a budget. A speaker learned to spend syllables like a quartermaster spends water, never less than the task demands, never more. Corrections were measured and framed so that mishearing could be caught without long repeats. If a term risked confusion with another under static, it was retired like a worn part and replaced with one that fit better. The living nature of the vocabulary made these replacements natural. You did not need to call a conference to fix a squeak. You and your partner worked it out, checked with your sergeant, and made sure the platoon understood before midnight. There was an ethical edge to all of this. Men carried knowledge in their mouths that could, if mishandled, cost lives on both sides. The counter to that risk was modesty and ritual. Notebooks were kept as if each page were a bandage. Operators watched each other's backs, not only with rifles but with reminders. Take a breath. Say it once. Keep the air clean. Habit is a structure, as strong as any bunker when built with care, and the habit of speaking well hardened into culture. The culture outlived any one battle because it fit the character of the work. People keep habits that save the people they love. The enemy's last resort was endurance. If they could not pry meaning from the present, perhaps they could store enough of the past to build a map that would pay off tomorrow. The counter to endurance was tempo. Nets refused to stay still in the ways that matter to an analyst. Voice identities moved with the units they served. Schedules flexed with weather and with the particular meanness of a hill. A day's learning decayed by morning. You can chart decay as loss. You can also chart it as protection. The system was built to shed skin without bleeding. When the shooting paused and men sank into the dazed quiet that follows noise, the countermeasures did not relax. That was their point. They were habits, not emergency measures. People who have done hard things well are allergic to luck. They prefer the boredom of repetition to the terror of improvising under fire. The pairs practiced, sergeants checked, lieutenants listened, and the discipline that looked like fussiness to outsiders revealed itself, over and over, as foresight. Foresight is the art of making tomorrow's luck unnecessary. When the ocean ceased to be an enemy and the maps stopped growing teeth, the voices came home. The men who had spoken them found that silence had its own work to do. They were told, politely and firmly, to keep their part of the story small. The habit was easy. It matched the way they had lived in the field. Do the job. Don't narrate yourself doing it. Some received citations folded as carefully as shirts. Some received handshakes and billets to distant barracks where the wind sounded nothing like mesas. Recognition arrived in pieces, and pieces take a long time to look like a whole. The long quiet had causes beyond bureaucracy. States hoard the brosset, tricks that save them, sometimes even after those tricks have been made obsolete by new machines. The irony is that what mattered most was never a trick at all. It was training and cohesion, and the fit between a language and the work asked of it. Those things are not easily stolen. They have to be grown, like anything living. Still, secrecy built walls, and on one side of a wall a man stands a little taller while on the other he hunches. Time eventually sands walls down. Before that smoothing, there were years when a voice that had saved a patrol was just a soft echo in a family kitchen. Memory has its own calendar. The men aged, and the people who loved them asked the questions families always ask. Some answers were simple. The food was bad, the nights were long. Some answers bore the shape of a withheld thing. It helped. It mattered. It was not mine alone to tell. Communities marked the days in other ways. Ceremonies borrowed bits of military posture. Uniforms hung in closets beside blankets. A certain kind of quiet in a certain kind of conversation became the local sign for pride. The pride did not need brass to keep it from rusting. Eventually, institutions caught up with what people had known. A page turned, and the names that had been carried by friends were printed on programs. Speeches were given. Flags were folded. Film crews found men whose voices still carried the evenness of someone who had learned to make language do exact work, and the country looked at the faces and heard the syllables, and recognized a portion of what had been given to it. Recognition is not payment, but it makes space for gratitude, to sit down and stay a while. The space matters. There were difficult conversations too. History, when told with care, must acknowledge the parts that hurt. The same hands that carried radios had, in some seasons of their youth, been punished for carrying their language at all. A nation that asked for a river to be piped into its war had earlier tried to dam the source. That contradiction does not untell the good work. It makes the good work heavier and therefore more real. The men who did it understood without needing lectures. They had learned to braid pride and sadness until the braid could pull. With time, the story migrated into the places where a country does its thinking about itself. Museums, syllabi, plaques on walls near airfields. Young people read about operations with names like beaches and volcanoes, and in the text a paragraph explained the way a human voice can carry more than news. Some of those young people put on uniforms themselves and discovered, in the first hard week, that radio discipline still separates good units from trouble. Technology gave them new bands, new encryptors, new tricks. None of that changed the feeling of a net well run, that sense of information arriving exactly when it should and exactly how it should, with no vanity in its posture. The men who had once leaned close in a foxhole to hear a partner say the word that would bend artillery smiled at the notion of legacy. Legacy sounds like a stone statue. They preferred wood, something that shows the work of the hands that shaped it, something that carries warmth. The warmth is in the way a phrase can still move a person to act. The warmth is in the way a language, spoken with respect, never belongs only to the past. Warmth does not need permission to endure. It only needs mouths willing to carry it forward and ears willing to treat it as gift. Strip away the romance and the filing cabinets, and you arrive at a simple formula that governed those days, and still governs days when people choose to be careful. Speed times clarity times meaning. If any factor drops to zero, the product is a shout into wind. The men who tuned headsets and tightened straps on helmets built their work to maximize all three, not with mathematics, but with practice. They found a way to say what mattered so that it arrived intact and in time. The enemy, for all his effort and skill, could not bend that product down before it did its work. What endures is not only the memory that a certain language once ran like a silver wire through the noise of the Pacific. What endures is the craft. Build your nets so that professionals can recognize each other without giving away the store. Train until a correction takes less breath than a complaint. Choose images that cut through fog. Keep your logs clean enough that the next tired woman or man can pick them up at 2 a.m. and understand where the day must go. Practice until patience survives fear. These are not lessons welded to a single war. They belong to firefighters and medics, to pilots and dispatchers, to anyone who must move a team through a hostile minute. There is another inheritance, quieter and harder to quantify. A language that had carried families and prayers proved it could carry steel without losing its shape. That proof matters wherever people are told that their words are too local for the world, too narrow for the day's big jobs. The lesson is not that every tongue must be drafted. It is that every tongue can surprise the world when treated as a source rather than an obstacle. Surprise is a kind of power. Shared wisely, it keeps communities from becoming museums. Walk back, in your mind, into a hot room where paper curls at the edges and a pencil rolls toward the lip of a table. A young operator leans in so far the headset cord pulls at the jack. He is listening for a pattern he hopes, this time, to catch. The voice arrives as it always does, unhurried, ungilded, a sentence that has learned to carry its own weight over bad ground. The operator writes what he can. He knows more than he did last week about bearings, about routine, about the way certain voices cluster when the tide turns, but he also knows that the next minute will again outrun the minute before. This is not failure. It is the shape of a contest in which victory belongs to the side that owns the present tense. Then step out of that room and into the sand where another young man, voice steady though his hands tremble, calls a correction that will keep his friends alive. He does not think about history. He thinks about a line of fire walking left 2 houses. He thinks about a stretcher and a man who should make it to the beach. He speaks, and the air makes space for the words, and the answer comes. When people say the system worked, they mean that this happened thousands of times and did not grow sloppy. They mean that craft held under weather and blood. The story reaches its last page not with a flourish but with a return. The return is to the plainness that was always the point. A net works when it is simple enough that tired people can do it well, and rich enough that their doing creates an advantage no enemy can capture before it vanishes into action. That is what was built. That is what was used. That is what remains when monuments fade and the last reels crumble into dust. The knowledge that human beings, given a reason and a discipline, can turn their own speech into shelter for each other. If you listen closely on certain mornings, when static still streaks old radios and the world smells like rain on dust, you can almost hear it. A line spoken cleanly, an answer that wastes nothing, the hush of a net that trusts itself. The birds are not birds anymore. They are people, and they are still talking, because people who have learned how to speak so that help arrives do not forget. They teach the next pair, and the next. The trick, if there ever was one, is only this: to keep the breath short and the meaning long, to know what you are pointing at, and to say it in time.